Hello, everyone. Unfortunately, we weren't able to finish our session the last time I came through. We ran the session up to a point, and I did promise that I would come around to take us on the remainder of the document. Unfortunately, I've not been able to make time out. So, what I've decided to do instead is to do a quick recording of the rest of the document and just talk you guys through it. Luckily, the rest of the document doesn't have a lot of calculations, so we should be fine. So I'll start off by doing a very quick recap of the things we covered in the last session, and then we can get straight into it. Remember that we had started things off by looking at the five key pillars of media strategy, and we had spoken about how under the WHO, the target audience is reach, frequency, GRPs, and CPRPs are the elements we would look to help us really understand how target audiences are targeted. We went about to define them. I spoke about how this is surfaced in AMPS, and we did a couple of examples, as you might remember. And then that took us to media penetration, frequency distribution, which I believe we covered in depth. And then we also ran a few examples as well with regards to average frequency and the likes. Then we talked about gross rating point, and we arrived at an understanding that there were different ways to calculate GRPs. We went ahead to look at a few examples, right, of how these GRPs can be arrived at, and of course how CPRPs are developed. Then we took a look at how you can use CPRPs to compare different programs, and also how you can use CPRPs to compare different media plans on a month-on-month basis, and trying to kind of identify where there might be issues with the plan. A couple more exercises here. I'm not going to belabor that. We went into the where. We started talking about CDIs and BDIs, and how if the client is not willing or able to give you your key markets, you are able to actually use this analysis to determine what are the key markets that will fall under investment and potential places you need to consolidate, your threshold markets, as well as identify markets that you need to ignore, and so on. Now that brings us to media mix, and I think this was about the point where we kind of stopped things. We had spent most of our time talking through the who and the where, and we needed to get into the what. In terms of media penetration, when we're trying to identify the right platforms to be on, we are able to use media data largely in this market from MediaStar. So it still goes back to the data sources that are available to us through AMPS, right? So all media product survey and your media diaries is what you're going to use to analyze this data, right? And for any given target audience, right? We've spoken about target audience in the last session. For any given target audience, you're able to analyze what the media penetration is, right? So we're able to know what platforms are best suited to get the maximum penetration within the target audience we are looking at. And this hierarchy can change depending on the target audience you're looking at. So for instance, if it was a much older target audience, you might see things like radio come tops, and maybe newspapers come a little bit further up, and cinemas might be even smaller in terms of the reach, and that can also differ if it was a much younger audience, with TV and maybe digital coming a little bit high up. So those are the things that you might want to look out for. Affinity is also a very important parameter to look at, because when it comes to affinity, and I was trying to explain the last session what affinity really is, as opposed to just understanding penetration, affinity really is the closeness or the propensity of that particular target audience to consume any particular medium a lot more than the average person in the population. So if this was an analysis being done for a particular target audience, then it would be very easy to say, well, as much as TV and radio and outdoor have the top media penetration, pay TV and cinema have the highest affinity for this particular target audience. The affinity being the red line you can see on the chart. But we also need to take into consideration cost as well. So affinity obviously can tend to be buying based on affinity. I mean, tends to be even more expensive. It can become more expensive if you're not careful about it. So you must look at the affinity of a medium in conjunction with the cost per thousand, or CPM, or cost per mil, depending on what terminology you want to use. Because this would really help you understand whether you should be investing behind that particular medium or not. And you also have to use this in combination with creativity. Creativity is a very important element when it comes to delivering the greatest ROI for your marketing campaign. Two different data sources, like you can see on the screen, both Ipsos as well as Comscore, both of them really agree that creativity actually does have the largest impact on delivering the best ROI for any media campaign. I mean, so it's really something that we have to look at when you're developing your plan. Now, beyond reach, there are three very crucial elements to any channel selection. From a strategy standpoint, of course, you need to bring the core idea to life. You need to understand your target audience costs, and you also need to establish the suitability of the medium for the task at hand, which is what we can also call role for comms. We're going to focus largely on role for comms in this particular session, because that's really the key thing that you need to consider. Now, fundamentally, there are four major roles for communications. So any campaign that you need to run, any communication you need to put out, largely sits within one or two or more of these comms models, right? So, and what are these comms models? So first of all, you could be an activating campaign. It could be an activating campaign where the priority really is to deliver information to an audience that has very high probability to be interested. Now, in activities like that, you are really focusing on cost-efficient reach, right? Because the consumer is already sensitized to the message. Now, if you're sensitized to the message already, then you don't need to invest so much money driving that communication. So essentially what you're going to be doing is looking for the most cost-effective way to reach that particular target audience. So an example would be if MTN wanted to give out free data, right? MTN wouldn't need to launch a brand new TV commercial telling people that there's free data next week. They might as well just send people text messages, right? To all the MTN subscribers. They don't need any big budget TV campaign to tell people there's free data, right? Because people are already sensitized to it and they will spread the message themselves, right? Now, another role for comms could be impacting. Impacting is kind of like the opposite of activating. And in this case, the priority is delivering information to an audience that has very low probability to be interested. So here it's all about cut through. It's all about interruption. It's all about driving maximum engagement. Just like the word says, impacting. A good example here would be maybe an insurance company selling life insurance, right? It's a difficult sell, at least in our part of the market, in our parts of the world, where people really are not as interested in life insurance, right? There's always a perception that once you start talking life insurance, it means you need him to start thinking about dying. And, typical Nigerian will say it's not his portion, right? So it's usually a difficult sell to an average Nigerian, especially one who is very religious. So how do you break through the clutter? So in this kind of communications plans, you're also looking for things that can cut through the clutter. So like the example I said, an insurance company, they're driving more on emotive, they're driving things that have a shock value. They're using media types in such a way that there is cut through and repetition in a way that it really captures your attention. The third role for comms is reinforcing. So we've spoken about activating, we've spoken about impacting, and now we are on reinforcing. Reinforcing is when the focus in this kind of situation is you are largely trying to, so here you're largely trying to reinforce an existing association. So the focus here is really a strategy that is just refreshing an existing memory structure. So you're just aiming for recency. So you're not looking to drive impact per se. You're not choosing to activate anything. You're just making sure that the saliency is there. So brands like Coca-Cola do a great job at this, right? There isn't any new messaging. There isn't any new product. The product has been the same for over 100 years. They're just reinforcing the messaging around open happiness or whatever the main thing is and just driving recognition and top of mind. Now that the last of the four fundamental rule for comms is building. Now this is a tricky one, and when it comes to building, the priority here is you're trying to build a new memory structure on an existing brand. So the focus here is that you're trying to layer on new memory structures on an existing structure, especially when the brand has already been hardwired in a certain way in the mind of the consumer. So an example I like to use will probably be something like Ribena. So Ribena has always been for kids, and then suddenly there's Ribena in cans, and you're trying to position it for teenagers and little young adults and so on. And that is a totally new memory structure on top of what people already know Ribena to be for healthy children or whatever. So that is a very different kind of job. So it's a balance between emotion and frequency. So there's a lot happening in that space. Okay, so let's move it on then. Sorry, give me a minute. Okay, so the next thing would be on role for comms. So still on role for comms, and internally at PhD, we've got tools that help us drive this, right? So it kind of makes it a lot easier for the planners to be able to determine what is the right role for comms for whatever they're working on. Because when it comes to the role for communication, at times you just really need to answer three very simple questions. And in this example is an activating role for comms, where the three simple questions you need to answer is the communication you're trying to drive, is it passing more information or is it trying to build the association? So that's the first question, and you need to know what side that slider should lean to. The second question you want to answer is, are you speaking to an audience that is disinterested, or are you speaking to an audience that is very interested in the messaging? So that's the second question, and that determines where you slide the slider on the screen too. And the third question is it strongly associated to a need state, or is it not associated to a need state, right? So if it's a drink, like there's a clear association to a current need state. But if it's life insurance, they may not necessarily be, the audience may not sufficiently associate it to their current need states, right? So and that is what kind of helps you answer. And based on what you choose, it kind of helps you determine the kind of platforms and channels that you need to be using. So in this example, where we have said it's an activating role for comms, and we know that the priority is we're talking to people with high probability to be interested, we want cost-efficient reach, so we're looking at shorter media lengths. We're looking at if we're going to use any media type, we're probably not going to use TV because it's going to be expensive. We're going to look for radio spots that could be targeted. We're looking for any messaging platform that allows us to use shorter lengths, shorter sizes, to drive the messaging straight, and then move people to our own platform where we can now elaborate on the things that we have to say. And that really brings in the cost efficiencies. And these are just a few examples of how we select. So if it's going to be an activating role, then I'm going to use radio, and I'm just going to use radio ads. And for out of home, rather than go do big static billboards, I could just buy for a very short period of time or time of day digital panels in selected places that just target and activate the people that I really want to speak to, right? So those are the kind of things that you would be seeing on the activating. Let's move on quickly to the fourth element here. And the fourth element is really around the when. And the when is around flighting and scheduling. Flighting and scheduling. So what is currently the practice when people flight or schedule campaigns? So one, it could be based on evaluation and benchmarking against whatever category norms have been established. It could be based on seasonality. So depending on the product, there could be a seasonality angle to your product or brand, and that's what kind of drives the flighting. So think of products like, I don't know, Vaseline, for instance, could say we would be seasonal. Close during the Harmattan period is when we would do a lot more Vaseline campaigns. Or you could have products like champagne that tends to do a lot more activity around celebration periods, so end of year, Christmas, things like that. And there are a lot of other products that are seasonal as well, right? Lipton, for instance, another good example. They tend to be around the Ramadan period when there's breaking of fast, and so on, and they tend to advertise more during that period. So seasonality can determine your flighting pattern. Reach and frequency benchmarks as well can also establish can also help to determine what your flighting pattern should be, because if you've got a specific reach target, then that will determine the number of weeks on air you need to be on air to help you achieve that reach goal. Budget constraints is the obvious one. If you've got only money for 6 weeks, then you're going to run a 6 weeks campaign. So let's get the obvious out of the way as well. There are also some dependencies on standard flighting periods, bursts versus continuity versus pulse. We're going to get into that in a bit. And you can also benchmark other categories where quantitative research is available. So while you might be in the, dairy category and you may not have sufficient data but there might be data in some other consumer packaged goods industry that is robust enough for you to benchmark against. And then you have enough proxy data to use to establish your own benchmarks. So those are also one of the ways that you can look at the benchmarking. But let's go straight into benchmarking itself. Now, in media planning, we need to establish benchmarks which can serve as standards or reference points. And some of the following parameters in media planning can be benchmarked. You can be benchmarking against optimal reach, and you can be benchmarking against CPRPs. I'm going to show you how we do both. In terms of benchmarking against optimal reach, again, I'm showing you from within a tool we have internally at PhD. And look, a lot of agency networks do have similar tools that they can use to drive reach benchmarking, to optimize their campaigns. This, however, is from a PhD bespoke tool, which is called Omni Studio. And that's what I've used to drive this example. So essentially, it allows us to understand what the combined reach of all the channels will be. So within each channel, we can single-mindedly plan for reach, remembering that we need to optimize within a 1 week period, and then we can now fleshing out that campaign over 4 weeks, 8 weeks, and so on. And the moment we hit diminishing returns within any certain channel, we can move investments to the next channel that has the best possibility of delivering maximum reach for that target audience. I'll come again. So this tool, in essence, enables us aggregate reach in such a way that we optimize the investments. In the example you're seeing on the screen, there is 151 million naira being invested over, so this is the 150 million naira being invested over a 22 weeks period for a certain brand X. And then we're able to optimize our media investments in such a way that we can determine what the maximum reach for each media type. So for TV, for instance, this is probably where the reach maxes out. And then when we've invested a sufficient amount of money, we can move investments to radio, move investments to out of home, and then we're able to split the budget based on their reach potential. So TV having more of the budget as against radio, as against out of home. And on that basis, we're able to deliver a maximum amount of reach. In this particular example, we're delivering a collective reach of 74.59%, an average frequency of 21.3, and a multi-channel GRP of 1,591. So this just gives you an example of how we can optimize our plans based on reach. Another way of benchmarking is benchmarking CPRPs, and I remember we had spoken about this in the earlier example, so this is just bringing that again to the fore, where you can look at the CPRPs delivered for different programs, and you can benchmark against that and determine what level of investments you need to deliver. I want to quickly touch on day parts, viewership, and listenership, because this is also being used to determine where you should invest your marketing naira. So the day part viewership traces the viewership habits of the target audience, right? And usually we would choose the peaks of that viewership to advertising, because that means there are more eyeballs there, isn't it? And during this peak, channel shares are plotted in order to determine the dominant channel. This can also be used for cross-channel scheduling, and I'll explain what that means. So in this example, what you're seeing is Lagos State, and on the Lagos State, we're able to take all the channels, TV channels in Lagos, pull out the data from MediaStar, and we're able to say, right, where are the viewership, the heavy viewership? So what you're looking at on the spider web chart you're looking at here is that you can see that where you have the largest splatter of colors, for instance, between, let's see if I can circle this out, between 8 a.m. here all the way down to around 9:45, and from here around 4 p.m. all the way down to what is that, 6:45, and then somewhere from 8 p.m. all the way down to somewhere close to midnight. So you can see where all the major viewership patterns. Yeah, you've also got something happening in the afternoon, right here. So this kind of gives you a sense of where the audiences are and how you need to invest your money, right? So you're kind of putting your budgets on where the biggest eyeballs are. Then we also look at channel shares. Now, within the system, and this is a very old example, but it still delivers the messaging. You're able to look at what the share of GRPs each channel delivers. In this example, you can see that ONTV followed by TVC and Galaxy are delivering more than 50% of the eyeballs of the viewership that Lagos has to offer. So if I was to invest wisely, I would also invest 50% of my Lagos media investment on these three platforms because they show the promise of delivering 50% of the audience, right? So, I mean, that is the kind of analysis that we need to do when we're trying to choose where we should invest. When it comes to cross-channel scheduling, we also need to understand that there is a type of appointment viewership that happens on TV. What I mean by that is there are certain programs you tune to certain stations to watch. By the time you layer multiple stations together, in this example, Galaxy, Silverbird, and ONTV, you're able to see where the highest viewership is at a certain time on different channels. So while in the mornings, say between 8 a.m. and 9:45, there's huge viewership on Galaxy for some reason. Between 11:45, it's Silverbird that seems to be taking the cake. And then when you move to the 5 p.m. hour, it's Galaxy again. And then between 8 and 11 p.m., then it's both, Silverbird and Galaxy tend to have, the upper hand here. And then somewhere in the middle of the day, you've got ONTV having the highest viewership here. So this kind of gives you a sense of where should I put my money on the different stations, and what time do these stations deliver the best viewership on their platforms. So this helps me to understand how the cross-channel scheduling should happen in one particular state. And in this example, you can see that the three different stations within the same state are performing well on different time bands, and that's what the whole cross-channel scheduling is about. Okay, so this just visually helps you understand how to go about that. Now, there are also very generic media strategies, right? Maximizing reach or maximizing frequency. These are the basic, what's the word I'm looking for? Generic strategies that people would use. So you could say, look, I just want to maximize reach, and what that means in essence is you're buying into more channels, more day parts to increase the absolute number of people that you can reach, quite simply. So an example, buying into 6 TV stations in Lagos across different time belts is a way to build reach as opposed to just buying on 2 stations, right? Because if you buy only on 2 stations, then you're just going to be reaching a very narrow group of people that only watch those stations, right? There could also be a bid to maximize frequency, right? So you can identify channels and day parts that will lead to maximization of duplication. So if I'm buying only during the morning news, or I'm buying into only STV and ONTV, focusing only on evening prime time, I'm clearly going to optimize my frequency because it's likely that the same group of people will be tuning in regularly. And there's a place for that in media strategy as well. Let's move on to scheduling patterns, if we may. There are 3 basic flighting shapes. Now, there are so many names people could give it, but essentially it kind of falls into these 3 buckets. You could either be doing a burst strategy where you are heavy for a month and then you go off for a couple of months and then you're back heavy with a bang and you're off for a couple of months, and that's a burst strategy. You could be executing a continuity strategy where you are not necessarily as heavy, but you're on throughout the year. It's like a very Coca-Cola type of strategy where They're never so much in your face, but they're always kind of there throughout the year, just keeping the salience there, keeping the awareness level, keeping it top of mind, but at a level that allows them to maintain 52 weeks on air throughout the year. Then you could also be using a pulse strategy, which is a kind of 1 week on, 1 week off, 1 week on, 1 week off kind of strategy. You're kind of pulsing the campaign in such a way that you are hitting the maximum, the right reach level in a certain week, but in the second week you're off, and you're hoping that the ad stock you've built up in the first week where you were heavy carries you on during that silent period until the next week when you're up again. But as a rule, continuity delivers the greatest ROI, but there's evidence that suggests that pulse is the best. And this is evident in some studies that have been done by Brand Science. There are some intermediate decisions that you need to understand and have in the back of your mind, because every platform has its pros and cons. And here's just a list of them. I'm not going to go through every single one because I think it's pretty self-explanatory. But it's important to understand that, say, TV, for instance, the pros would be sponsorship opportunities. There's an opportunity for niche targeting. Audiovisuals definitely have better impact. They drive better emotions. National coverage. You can build reach very rapidly via TV. Brand recall is higher. People tend to have better credibility when you're on TV. But the cons could be, of course, switching, right? Your remote control. People can flip from one channel to another, so it's easy to miss people, right? There's a high unit cost. There's also a very high production cost. And every other media platform, from radio to newspaper and out of home, all have their pros and cons. Like I said, I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but you can, if you go through it, then you kind of get the gist of it, right? Every platform has its advantage and disadvantage, and it's important that every media planner or strategist or anyone working in marketing understands the pros and cons of these platforms. Right. So I want to also speak on something called ad stock, and it's important that we understand the optimal way to spread our activities throughout the year, because what tends to happen is that you usually do not have unlimited resources to keep running campaigns throughout the year. So there's also always a tendency for you to have to, be on for some time and be off for some time and make your investments stretch as long as possible. So that's where the theory of ad stock comes in. Now, every media channel has a certain level of ad stock, and I'll explain what ad stock is. It's essentially the residual awareness that your brand has even when you're off air. So what that means is, if you watch an advertising today, you don't necessarily forget it tomorrow, but over time you will forget it, right? Now, the period of time it takes you to forget that ad is what the ad stock refers to, right? It's also being calculated by some research work to show that TV has the highest ad stock, larger around 80%, while platforms like online display have only about 10% ad stock. So what does that mean? You could possibly remember a TV commercial you saw 3 weeks ago, but you probably don't remember all the banner ads you saw even today on Facebook, right? So online display tends to have the lowest ad stock in terms of how memorable and the amount of recall you have. TV tends to be the highest, while cinema and newspapers kind of sit in the middle, right? And an understanding of this helps us to flight our campaigns. Again, I'm going into an example using one of the tools we have, Omni Studio, where we're able to look at ad stock levels based on our understanding that the different media types deliver different ad stock levels. And then we can see within the system how long we can afford to be off air before our ad stock starts to go towards zero, and then we have to start building activities back through the campaigns. So this is a very interesting way to be able to advise the client on when you can go off air and when you can come back on, and be able to scientifically explain it. Right, that brings us to the last part of this, which is around media weights. How much should you invest? Now, we need to understand the interplay between reach and frequency, right? Are there situations where you need more reach? Yes, when you need to build new news, building brand awareness, announcing a promotion, changing creative strategy, trying to beat competition. All that could deliver more, could require more reach. Are there instances where you need more frequency? Yes, when the brand awareness levels are already high, right? Due to maybe a cumulative effect of past advertising, or when the advertising noise levels of competition is also already high, and then you're trying to ramp up your activity. So the telcos do that a lot, right? So if Glo and Airtel is already making so much noise on some data bundle, MTN has to up the ante, and that obviously ramps up frequency quite a bit. So understanding how these two interplay is very important. So how do we establish media weights, right? There are so many ways people look at this. It could be based on prevailing wisdom. Some strategists have learned from experience what works best. They use this learning to inform future decisions, right? So it's more anecdotal than anything else. Then it could be scheduling, right? When the market for a brand seems flat during the entire year, so sales are approximately even during all the 12 months, you can use the scheduling strategy and recency theory to suggest that advertising should be done every month. So you're looking at your scheduling to establish how much weight you should be. Your flighting could help to determine. Now, if you've determined, for instance, how you want to flight, I want to be 3 months on, 1 month off. On the basis of that, you can estimate what the investment levels will now be required to deliver that flighting, right? Media weights could also be determined by how heavy is your introductory effort. So if you're launching a new brand, the weight of that introductory effort could also determine how much the weight of the investment needs to be. If you're, and there are other elements. I don't want to go through every single thing. Heavy up scheduling. Like for instance, when a planner wants to spend more advertising when consumer is buying heaviest and spend less other times. So maybe you are the kind of brand that says, look, I need to spend more during Christmas because my consumers are more susceptible to buying during Christmas, or I want to spend more during the end of the month when they've collected their salaries, they are more susceptible to buying. That could also be used to determine weights. There could be geographic market weights in terms of the number of markets or cities in a certain state, and of course, combining your media vehicles. Now, it's also important to understand what happens when budgets are fixed, right? So something has to give. So the diagrams you're seeing in here kind of explains that, right? The first box you're seeing here is speaking about, the first box on your left, by the way, is speaking about when you have, to buy heavy amounts of continuity or in plenty markets, you're going to have to sacrifice reach and frequency. If you need to buy heavy amounts of frequency and be continuous, then you're going to sacrifice reach and the number of markets you can be in. If you need to have very high frequency in a lot of markets, you're not going to be on air for long because the money is going to run out, and therefore reach is going to be affected as well. And if you want to have high reach in a lot of markets, of course, continuity and frequency are going to have to be sacrificed. So it's just understanding the interplay of these four elements. Depending on what the client and the brand requires, you kind of know already what is going to have to be sacrificed to ensure that the other elements are able to be optimized, right? Great. So, but the question again should be, should we really be planning for frequency? Historically, most people would say, well, the 3+ rule, and some modern marketing science has proven that probably isn't the best way to go. You want to focus on building reach because frequency tends to be a natural consequence of your attempts to build reach. But we're going to have to take that in a very separate session. There is another bit which I had here, which is around a new mindset for planning principles, but that really goes beyond the current course content, so I'm not going to dwell so much on that. I'm going to park it here because the other elements here are really around things outside the curriculum. So thank you for listening. I've tried to do this in, it's 34 minutes. I thought I did this in under 30 minutes, but hopefully you will make out time to listen to it. I'm doing this just because I know that I may not be able to make it into the class to talk you guys through it, but at least if you have this recording, you're able to run through the session on your own. All right, so thank you very much, and thanks for listening.